Genshin and Wu, what time? Oh boy, they're already advertising Siege Win. Fuck, wow, that's a terrible banner.
Perhaps the most important development was that Susan Curtis became Jeannie's friend. And three wars broke out. One between David Rigler and Jean Butler, one between the Research Project and the National Institute of Mental Health, and one inside Jeannie's brain. Because Jeannie's linguistic progress just stopped. The brain's language center is divided into Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Wernicke's area handles speech processing. Broca's deals with
Broca.
grammar.
I had a
Jeannie's
frog
Broca
named
development
Broca.
hit a wall, and it was impossible to tell whether it was the limits of her abnormally developed brain or the limits of language acquisition. Was research on Jeannie proving that Chomsky or Lenenberg were right or that they were wrong? Yeah. And that meant that the NIMH really had no idea what was continuing to fund. They eventually pulled the grants because David Rigler and most of the other researchers were, in the eyes of the Institute, asking for money to sort of just see what happened to Jeannie. David Rigler tried to explain.
Nobody knew exactly how to deal with this. We were doing our best. We got the best kind of counsel, the best kind of advice. We had to sort that out and take that as it came. But we did the very best we knew how, and we believe that nobody knew any better.
That is not a strong grant proposal. But the conflict over how Jeannie would live and with whom destroyed everything. Jeannie had been at the children's hospital until Jean Butler, the special education teacher, said she had been exposed to German measles and had exposed Jeannie as well. So Jeannie was quarantined in Butler's home, and both of them seemed to like that arrangement, so she stayed. Butler claimed fantastic progress with language, emotions, manners, physical health, though researchers were never quite able to actually verify it. Butler even kicked the researchers out for the summer, claiming it was too much strain on Jean. Susan Curtis was concerned.
a fun summer. It was a summer that included weeks of concern and anxiety and, anger and all kinds of things because he and I were kicked out of his house. She was crazy. She didn't want the other attachments. I mean, she used to walk around saying, I am going to be the next Annie Sullivan. This girl is going to make me famous.
Annie Sullivan was the nurse who rescued Helen Keller. Jean Butler's application to become Jeannie's foster parent was denied, and then Jeannie spent 4 years living with David Rigler and his family, including his wife, who was doing her own work with Jeannie.
This is a really big
extremely
yikes.
unorthodox for the lead researcher on a project to have the main research subject live with them, but it did give Jeannie an opportunity to function as part of a real family for 4 years. When the research project concluded in 1975, Jeannie went back to live with her mother in the home she grew up in. Her mother had been considered by the courts to be blameless in her abuse, and Jeannie had a bond with her. But Jeannie required 24/7 care, and her mom just couldn't manage it. So Jeannie went into a series of foster placements, and each was more physically and mentally abusive than the last. She eventually came back to the children's hospital, where doctors found that the foster home had used an ice cream stick to extract from her when she had become constipated. And Jeannie refused to open her mouth at all. Even eating, she forced the food between her lips. It turned out that she had been severely beaten for vomiting at the last foster home. And in Jeannie's mind, if you never open your mouth, you can't vomit. If you can't vomit, you can't be beaten. So she went back to silence and using hand signals. Jeannie's mother, backed by Jean Butler, sued the hospital and its researchers for excessive and outrageous testing on Jeannie. David Rigler submitted a demand for owed compensation to Jeannie's minuscule estate, which was a few $1,000s controlled by John Miner, a lawyer who had investigated the deaths of Marilyn Monroe and Robert Kennedy, and who now had control over Jeannie's affairs after becoming enamored with the whole case. He'd actually bought the gun Jeannie's father had shot himself with as a memento. What began as an incredible opportunity to give an abused girl the chance at life she never had and to learn about how the human mind worked turned into a nightmarish garbage plate of lawsuits, money, and self-serving rescue fantasies. Jeannie went back into state care. In Jeannie, a scientific tragedy, Russ Reimer described her 27th birthday. A large, bumbling woman with a facial expression of cow-like incomprehension. Her eyes focused poorly on the cake. Her dark hair has been hacked off raggedly at the top of her forehead, giving her the aspect of an asylum inmate. Susan Curtis never really got caught up in the drama with Jeannie. The book she wrote about Jeannie's linguistic developments, she donated every dollar of the proceeds to Jeannie's estate. The woman who had spent so many hours, days, and years with Jeannie, partly as a linguistic researcher and mostly as a friend, took her on walks, shopping trips, said, I missed her when she wasn't in my life. I would pay a lot of money to see her. I would do a lot. I'd give up my job. I'd change careers to see her again. But no one ever did. The last anyone knew, Jeannie was still alive somewhere in state care. She would have just turned 67 2 months ago. And her name isn't even Jeannie. She was called Jeannie to protect her privacy as a minor. There's no information on who chose it or how it came to be. Jeannie is an anglicized version of the Arabic jinn, invisible beings that can be either good or evil, and who could be called upon for protection or magical aid. Our modern tales have genies appearing out of bottles and granting a series of wishes to whomever releases them. Over the years, how many researchers and self-interested parties rubbed the bottle and then pressured Jeannie to grant their wishes? How many called upon a horrifically abused teen to give them protection and a kind of deus ex machina solution to their career ambitions? All while Jeannie herself needed to be protected and to have her wishes granted, her wish to speak, her wish to love and be loved, her wish to live a life. Wishes devastated by an abusive father, wishes exterminated in the name of science, and a life dehumanized by a code name. Her name is Susan. And as always, thanks for watching.
Take it easy. Got her! Got her! Skyward! Scatter! Scatter! Skyward!
Bruh. Bruh, yelling.
Got him! Skyward! Inconsequential!
A little while back, I replayed God of War 2018. Ever since, I've been thinking a lot about the Valkyrie side quest. It involves a challenging and engaging series of fights where you're pushed to learn the unique patterns of each Valkyrie and master new skills to overcome them. And not only is it satisfying to just get good enough to beat them, but they also provide players with a lot of materials and items that will make them far more powerful. The quest culminates with the best and hardest fight of the entire game against Sigrun, the Valkyries, whose moveset is comprised of all the moves of the previous Valkyries, and she unleashes them against you at an overwhelming rate. But what makes the fight so cool is that you already know how to beat her before going in. It's just about getting used to the pace of the fight and making as few mistakes as possible. Even though this was the third time I've used this questline, beating her felt incredible, because the fight is that demanding. Regardless of how many times I learn it, every time I go back, it's just as hard. After the adrenaline wore off,
I think you just suck then.
Battle, which included the Retribution Pommel, a solid enchantment, and some crafting materials, all of which would help me be more powerful. And thought,
Ad Astra Abyssos.
what's the point
Welcome.
of this shit?
Thank you for completing Ad Astra.
The progression of the Valkyrie questline is partially tied to progressing the main story, so even though not every player will face Sigrun at the exact same point, no matter what, it will happen pretty close to the end of the game, meaning these pieces of gear will mostly be used for just the final fight. The mileage of these rewards will be better for those who play New Game Plus, but as I am not one of those people, their usefulness was super limited. And what makes things worse is the final boss isn't even that hard. It's way easier than the Sigrun fight, and honestly easier than a lot of the Valkyrie fights. It has multiple checkpoints throughout, and no section is that long, so even if you do die, you're not going to lose much progress. Not to mention, in order to get strong enough to take on Sigrun, you'll almost certainly have to find and level up some of the best gear in the game, so mix that with the strong abilities earned from beating her, and it leaves you wildly overpowered for the main quest, causing the final boss to be a bit tricky. trivial. And to be clear,
I find all 900 fine
able
codes.
to decimate anything from your path because you did a ton of optional content can make you feel powerful and like the extra work you did paid off, and that certainly is appealing to a lot of folks. Personally though, I feel let down when what should be a huge challenge isn't. It ends up feeling a bit anticlimactic. The final boss of the game can be the hardest, but when there are tier 1s, it lessens their overall impact. And here that was caused by the rewards I got for the wrestling. Rewarding players seems like such a you just give them something better than what they had before. But if done incorrectly or at the wrong time, it can throw off the balance of the game and lead to players feeling unsatisfied with the stuff that should make them feel great. It's not just about giving players something cool, it's about making them feel like they got something cool. That might sound the same, but it is different. A lot more goes into the latter. Now, rewards come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they are things to collect, sometimes they are things to use, sometimes they are stats you gain, sometimes they are progress you make, sometimes they are moments you experience, and within each of those categories there are many different levels of importance. Collecting a coin in Mario will give you a brief moment of feeling rewarded, but that will sustain you for about as long as it takes to grab it. But getting a star will make you feel better for longer and have more of an impact on how you move forward. Small rewards beget big rewards, and big rewards beget bigger rewards. Together, all kinds of rewards are used as breadcrumbs to help usher players along in a way that ideally leaves them feeling satisfied. And it's the question of how to make rewards actually feel satisfying that is so tough to answer. For the most part, rewards can largely be split into two categories, intended and optional, although there is some overlap between the two. Intended rewards are the things you are supposed to get. They're typically tied to the main line of progression and are composed of stuff the developers don't want you to miss. They come in the form of abilities that make up the core mechanics of the game, items that have a significance to both the story and gameplay, experience
I don't like this
points
team. I think
from taking out the enemies on the
I think
primary
I
path,
prefer
and all sorts
Shania.
of other things. These rewards aren't necessarily mandatory, as many titles are a bit more open-ended than that, but more often than not, they are, and the ones that aren't are still pretty hard to miss. As developers can generally count on players receiving these rewards, games are often balanced around them, whether that be adding new challenges to account for new abilities, or introducing stronger enemies to match higher-leveled players. On the other end, optional rewards are things gathered by the player that aren't necessary to complete the game. These often contain similar things as the intended ones, like weapons and experience points and upgrades, but developers can't guarantee players will encounter them, so they tend to play less important of a role. Optional rewards are obviously tied to optional content, so it is much harder to balance the core part of the game around them, as it's impossible to predict how much of it any given player will engage with. For instance, if the developers balance a game for those who only do the main objective and nothing else, the main line of progression will become far too easy for those who get a handful of optional upgrades. And if they balance it for those who spend all their time trending off the main path, it will make the game extremely difficult for those who stick close to the main quest, essentially turning all optional content into mandatory content. So developers are faced with the task of picking a spot on that continuum that will feel satisfying to either the most amount of players possible or to the demographic they are primarily aiming to appeal to. The most common approach seems to be where games are balanced in a way that doesn't require doing specific optional content, otherwise it wouldn't be optional, but does call for doing some optional content in order to not fall behind the demands of the main part of the game. For example, in every Zelda title, you don't need to collect any one heart piece, but if you don't get any, combat will be much harder because of it. And unless you're really good, you'll probably die a lot and maybe not be able to beat the game. So you'll need to gather a handful of them at some point. With any optional reward like this, the strategy is to scatter so many across the world that even the least observant player will be able to stumble across a few of them. These can be done for big rewards like heart pieces or small ones like crafting materials. And the amount the player will need to collect of either will depend on their own skill as well as the scope of the game. But for the most part, things lean on the side of not needing to do a ton of optional stuff. It's meant to present the game in a way where players will have somewhat unique experiences by delving into different optional content, but not be pushed into spending a wild amount of time on things that aren't the main story. Given that the majority of people who start a game are unlikely to even finish it, this sort of approach that has a more casual feel makes a fair bit of sense, as it lowers the risk of creating friction that might make the player abandon the game. So while this isn't universal, many titles end up containing a mixture of intended rewards, optional rewards that the developers intend players to collect a certain amount of,
They don't have
and purely
Kirara anywhere
optional
either.
rewards. rewards. And if this all sounds like it must be a nightmare to balance, that's because it is. No two people will approach a game in the exact same way, and while devs can attempt to fine-tune it for a certain type of player, most will still fall outside of that. At a glance, it may seem like optional rewards are the source of all this trouble, and it certainly does add a complex layer to it all. But to be honest, intended rewards on their own are a hard thing to get right. Like, how often should players be rewarded with something? Does it need to be an upgrade, or can it just be story progression? What sorts of things will even feel like a worthwhile reward? How will it affect the gameplay moving forward? There is a lot to answer and no one-size-fits-all solution, as every game is trying to accomplish something different. Also, depending on the title's focus, it might not need or even be able to reward the player in certain ways. But there certainly are patterns that we see a lot across games. So like for intended rewards, they usually are either tied to game progression or some form of character progression. Of the two, game progression is definitely the simpler type of reward, as it is focused on just giving the player more game to play. You finish a level and you're rewarded with a new one. You collect the MacGuffin and now you can open the big locked door to the next area. By making clear separations between content, it gives players a moment to celebrate the progression instead of taking it for granted. That's why we get flagpoles at the end of a stage and nice sound effects when a quest is completed, to make clear that something notable happened. As long as the game is enjoyable and players want to keep seeing more of it, presenting progression as a reward in these ways is a solid and relatively easy approach, even if it is a bit empty in terms of actual substance. Character progression, on the other hand, can be a far more powerful reward, but is also more complicated to pull off. It's all about providing new ways for the player to interact with the established world, whether that be through having higher stats or different moves or special items. Getting stronger is a central theme in many video games, and it is something most players are motivated by, so any sort of reward that helps build to that can go a long way. But this creates some challenges, one of the big ones being that games tend to get more difficult as they go along. So how can developers make a player feel like they're getting more powerful while also continuing to challenge them throughout? This can be accomplished in a few different ways, and it really all comes down to execution. For instance, in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, there are a handful of ways you can get stronger, but the two that feel most impactful come from collecting prayer beads and memories, with the former increasing your health and poise and the latter increasing your strength. Prayer beads are often a reward for taking out mini-bosses, and memories are a reward for beating the main bosses. For the most part though, these upgrades are offset by the fact that enemies get stronger in each